Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video I shall be taking a look and giving you a review on the first Doctor story, The Celestial Toymaker. It's a story that I've quite recently watched the recon of, and I have decided that will be a good story to discuss on the channel. The Celestial Toymaker is one of the most interesting and bizarre Doctor Who stories ever made. It consists of 4 episodes, the last of which being the only surviving episodes, as all the others are sadly missing. The story itself sees a number of games that the Doctor, Stephen and Dodo have to unwillingly take part in, which have been created by the Toymaker himself. However, these games aren't as simple as they look, as they have a deadly surprise should you lose. So let's take a look into this very interesting 4-part story. The plot of the story is incredibly simplistic, but at the same time it's very clever and has a unique structure to it. It's a story that's so different from what we've seen before, due to each episode showing us Stephen and Dodo playing a different game each time. The Doctor, however, only has to play one game, but Stephen and Dodo must complete their series of games before the Doctor can finish his game. The Toymaker forces these games onto the Doctor and his companions by making the TARDIS vanish from existence, and so by winning the games, the Doctor and co will be given the TARDIS as their prize. In the first episode, we see Stephen and Dodo play the game Blind Man's Buff. Blind Man's Buff is played in a spacious area such as outdoors or in a large room, in which one player, designated as It, is blindfolded and gropes around attempting to touch the other players without being able to see them, while the other players scatter and try to avoid the person who is It, hiding in plain sight and sometimes teasing them to influence them to change direction. In this version of the game, Stephen and Dodo are faced with annoying clowns that are effectively dolls, and end up trying to deliberately disrupt the game by cheating as well as causing other problems. A common theme throughout all the games is that the result in the loss of the game is death, which is a pretty brutal twist on these games that appear to be so innocent. Of course, Stephen and Dodo win the game in the end, and at the end of each game they come across what appears to be the TARDIS, but it turns out to be an empty shell. And inside it they come across a riddle to solve, and this continues throughout the following games. In the second game, we see Stephen and Dodo play a game of musical chairs, but in this version you've probably guessed it already, the consequence of losing the game is death. We see Stephen and Dodo arrive in what seems to be a huge massive throne room, where we are introduced to 2 new characters, those being a king and a queen. In this point in the story, we still don't know much about the Toymaker himself, for instance his origins and where he comes from, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it only makes the character more interesting as well as the story itself. In this version of musical chairs, Stephen and Dodo arrive in a room which contains different sizes and shapes of chairs in the 2 adjoining rooms, as there is 3 in one room and 4 in the other. The game also consists of 2 dolls which Stephen and Dodo have to put on the chairs. Only a few of the chairs are safe, while the other chairs, however, are basically death chairs. For instance, Dodo sits on one of the chairs and she is unable to move to the point where she is pretty much a part of the chair. A few of the other chairs are electrifying chairs, while the other chairs collapse and cause a person's bone to break. Much like the previous game, Stephen and Dodo win, and they move on to another fake TARDIS containing another riddle. It gets to a point in the story where we hardly ever see the Doctor. Now this might suggest that the story drags a bit, but it still manages to keep the viewer engaged throughout. While this episode is pretty damn dark, I can't help but be amused by the ridiculous ideas that are presented on screen, as I can just imagine the writer Brian Hales having an absolute blast writing this particular episode. Episode 3, in my opinion, is probably the weakest out of all the 4 episodes. While it's not a bad episode by any means, there isn't really much going on, and the game feature that isn't all that interesting either. In this game we are introduced to 3 more characters who are the chef boy, the cook and the sergeant. The objective of the game is that Stephen and Dodo have to find a hidden key that lies somewhere in the kitchen, and that key gives them access to the next room. Another problem I have with this episode is that it sometimes can be a bit of a headache due to the fact that the cook and the sergeant spend most of the time arguing with each other, as the sergeant is causing problems for the cook by pretty much smashing up in her entire kitchen, while the other chef boy is just trying his best to hide given any opportunity. It's not a bad episode by any means, but it just gets very repetitive, and not all that much really happens. If you've seen the recon or listened to the soundtrack, you may understand where I'm coming from. Of course, the 2 main regulars find the key to the next room, which features the next game that's called the Dancing Floor. This game doesn't really last that long, as all we see Stephen and Dodo do is trying to get past some dancing dolls that are blocking the way to the TARDIS. And like all the other games, they fairly quickly win the game, as there's no real threat in this episode. The final game for the two companions is Hopscotch, but in this game, if you fall off the hopscotch platforms, you die. We are introduced to a character called Cyril, who's probably the worst opponent and probably the most annoying character in the entire story. They have to face, as he is not constantly trying to find his way to make Stephen and Dodo lose by cheating at every moment. It's really a satisfying and quite hilarious way the Cyril character dies, as it gets to a point in the episode where you really hate his guts. When the two regulars win the game, they eventually find the real TARDIS, and all they have to do now is wait for the Doctor to win his game against the Toymaker himself. In the final episode, which is the only episode that exists, the Doctor has to play a game called the Trilogic game. I found it quite hard to understand how this game actually works, but I did some research on the TARDIS wiki, and the challenge that the Doctor is faced with is that the Toymaker has given him only 1023 moves to finish the game, and if he loses, he'll be forever trapped in the Celestial Toymaker's toy room. It's quite an interesting way in which he wins the game, as he decides to use voice control as a way of moving the last piece. The episode probably has one of the most satisfying endings to a Doctor Who villain, as we see the Doctor pretty much end the Celestial Toymaker's own universe, and his reaction to it is just brilliant and priceless. Overall, the Celestial Toymaker is a fantastic story which was really well made, written and acted throughout. All the actors in it are great and give really brilliant performances, especially Michael Gough, who as the Toymaker, such a brilliant actor to play a very interesting and manipulative character. I don't really have any problems with the story itself, but what I will say is that when the clowns laugh, it can get pretty annoying at times, and in episode 3 is pretty slow as well. I strongly recommend you experience the story either via the soundtrack if you can get a copy, or the recon, which you could probably find somewhere on the internet. As for a rating for the story, I'm probably going to give it a 7 out of 10, as it's definitely one of the great William Hartnell stories. It's just a shame that the majority of the episode is missing, but I would highly recommend checking out the final episode on the Lost in Time box set, even without context. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new, and stay tuned for more Doctor Who content, and let me know what you think of the Celestial Toymaker.